When it comes to trafficking, some estimates in the U.S. are around $10 billion annually. My budget at the Department of Justice was less than $100 million. We're not matching with this criminal enterprise.
Where do you see some of the biggest deficiencies in the current response?
There was a community that knew it was happening, but failed to report.
We can put a simple, secure way. All of a sudden, we can see a lot more data coming in.
And over the course of 9 months, we reduced gang crime by over 80%.
As a detective, what does it really mean to build a human trafficking case?
I remember the day of trial. She came into the courtroom, head down at the ground the whole time. The prosecutor was asking questions, really great job testifying. But then it got to that last question the prosecutor had to ask. And he said,
Hello, and welcome to the Teen Protectors podcast. I'm Brittany Dunn, the COO and co-founder of Safe House Project, and I'm joined today by my co-host.
I'm Kristi Wells. I am the CEO and other co-founder of Safe House Project. Safe House Project is a national anti-trafficking organization that helps victims escape their trafficking situation, helps train people to identify and respond to trafficking, and ultimately is uniting communities to eradicate trafficking in America by 2030. We're really excited to be here today, and you want to introduce our guest?
Absolutely. Well, our guest today is Bill Woolf. He is a former Fairfax Police Department detective, gang detective. I always love this part because it's the longest resume you guys are ever going to hear. Then he went to the Department of Justice and worked for the Office of Victims of Crime before being pulled up to the White House as the human trafficking czar. And then he left the White House after writing the first national action plan to combat human trafficking in the United States, where now he works in the private sector, helping organizations across the U.S. respond to human trafficking. So welcome, Bill.
Thank you so much. A pleasure to be here.
Awesome. Well, getting started, obviously, you know a lot about this issue, but let's go back to the first time that you really learned what human trafficking is. Can you share a little bit about that experience?
Sure, yeah. You say I know a lot about it. It's because I've been here for a long time, hence the gray hairs in my beard. But no, going back many years ago, the first case that we ever worked I was a gang detective in Northern Virginia. We were working a case against MS-13, which many people have heard about, very notorious gang. And so as we were investigating that gang, we were looking at how to really dismantle them on a large scale. And so we had cultivated and inserted an informant into the gang. And we said, hey, listen, we want to know what type of crimes the gang's involved in and how they're making their money. And one night, the informant came to us and he said, hey, listen, they want us to drive these girls around that are engaged in what he described as a form of commercial sex. Now, I had 8 years of investigative experience, but I had never heard the words human trafficking used in the context of what was happening here in the United States. And so we said, okay. And so he went out and he was driving these girls around, and he called one night and he said, the girl I'm driving around tonight looks really young. I'm not comfortable. So my partner and I did our due diligence. We went out and we interdicted the situation and found it was a 16-year-old girl. We really didn't understand what we had. We went to the prosecutor and explained what we had found, and the prosecutor looked at me and my partner and said, you got a great human trafficking case. My partner and I looked at each other and said, what the heck is human trafficking? We didn't have any idea that it was happening here, and particularly in our nation's backyard, the capital of our nation's backyard. And so that first case really opened my eyes to the reality of what was happening, not just in Northern Virginia, but all across our country. And that sparked sort of a complete change in career path into this field of anti-human trafficking.
Wow. I mean, there's so much in that. Just the lack of understanding that has been there for so long, and how critical it is for our law enforcement to understand the issue and then how to respond. But let's kind of pull out a little bit of the organized crime element, because we know that it has a lot of different business models, and organized crime is one component of that. Can you share a little bit about how MS-13, Crips, Bloods, how that kind of is operating in the United States and where we're at today?
Yeah. Well, I think, to kind of go backwards, your point of, even law enforcement's not properly trained, right? It's one of the things that I think we need to be better in this country of training our frontline professionals. We depend on our law enforcement officers, brave women and men that put on that uniform every single day and go out and protect our communities. But we're not equipping them the right way to be able to identify what's happening within those communities. And so oftentimes it gets swept under the rug, or it gets misidentified, mislabeled during the course of their investigations, We have some really great gang investigators across the country. I've had the pleasure of working with several of them. But oftentimes when we think of organized crime, we're thinking of drugs, we're thinking of narcotics trafficking, firearms trafficking, these things that are more, we could almost say traditional crimes, right? Things that we're very familiar with, that we have standalone federal agencies like the DEA and the ATF, right, whose focus is on these different types of crimes. When it comes to trafficking, it's very easy for a lot of these criminal syndicates, if you will, for these networks to be able to shift some of their operations into selling humans, particularly selling humans for sex, selling humans into labor trafficking scenarios. And we see a lot with whether it's our domesticated gangs like the Bloods and the Crips that you mentioned, using it as a form to generate revenue. Some of our transnational gangs like MS-13, 18th Street. We also know our motorcycle gangs are involved in this type of conduct as well. They see it as less risk with a higher yield, right? They're able to make more money off of selling people than they are off of drugs or guns or any other illicit materials.
No, I mean, I think that's so critical for people to understand is that we really are at a place where human trafficking is the fastest growing crime, second only now to the drug trade, and driving globally $150 billion industry. And so it is something that is just continually weaving its way into the very fabric of our community. But I think the other thing that was really interesting that you kind of were talking about is that need to train our law enforcement. We had survivor leader Audrey Morrissey on a few episodes ago, and she was just talking about how critical it is to direct funding into our law enforcement for that training, for them to have the tools and the technology in order to really interdict these crimes. And I think that's a piece we sometimes miss. I think we think, oh my gosh, law enforcement has all of these tools at their disposal, and we fail to realize maybe some of the limitations or resource constraints. Can you kind of speak to what you believe is the opportunity to help increase funding for our law enforcement in this issue?
Yeah, I think training is critical. Being able to get them tools and resources, whether that is technology or whether that is identification tools, training, et cetera. We have to understand that, oftentimes those that are in a patrol capacity, they're going to be the first ones to come across a potential trafficking situation. But they're tasked with so many things. One call could be a cat in a tree, and the next call could be a homicide that they're responding to. And so realizing just sort of everything that they're responsible for. And we know right now the reality is that it's becoming more difficult to recruit new law enforcement officers. Many agencies across the country have staffing issues. They're stretched very, very thin. And so these officers have to make quick decisions. They have to be able to quickly assess a situation. And we know that human trafficking oftentimes overlaps with so many other crimes. These officers are getting called for whether it would be a drug complaint or an intoxicated person, a noise violation, domestic dispute, so many other things that they're being called to. And their minds are trying to process everything during that call and deal with that situation to then get on to the next one. And so the more that we can equip those on the front lines, law enforcement, and not just law enforcement, right? We have educators, we have social workers, we have counselors. So many people have an opportunity to observe. The better we can equip them with tools and resources, the more that we're going to be able to increase identification rates and get the specialized investigators into a position where they can work the cases the way that they need to be worked, help survivors exit exploitation, and hold offenders accountable.
Yeah. Talk to me about a little bit of your time at the Department of Justice as the acting director of the Office of Victims of Crime. Federally, where do you feel like we're at on putting intentional focus and dollars and resources behind fighting this as a criminal enterprise?
Yeah, funding is critical, right? As much as we wish that we could just have a money tree in the backyard to be able to get everything that we need to fight off the evil. I know, right? It's a lot of people think there is one somewhere. I haven't found it yet. But the reality is we talk about it being a $150 billion industry worldwide. Some estimates in the U.S. are around $10 billion annually. My budget at the Department of Justice was less than $100 million, right? So we're really not matching with this very highly sophisticated, highly motivated criminal enterprise. And so we have to be better at understanding. Now, Yes, we need to increase funding, but I also think that we can be more efficient and effective with our funding by investing in real solutions, technology-based solutions. We know the bad guys, the traffickers, are using technology to further their enterprises. So we need to make sure that law enforcement also has technology tools and the training to stay in front of those offenders that are out there.
So recently we had Susan Young on, and obviously you were instrumental in her life and her family's life, being the detective over her case. You know, we talk about the gangs, and that seems really scary, and it is really scary. Can you kind of speak to a little bit of your lens into their family story, but also then what are some of the other ways this is happening right here in our own communities?
Yeah. I think what's important to understand, and I think Susan's family and her situation really highlight that, is this is not an issue that is just impacting impoverished communities. Certainly, poverty is a risk factor, right? But we know that traffickers are also targeting middle to upper class homes. They're targeting any vulnerability that they can identify and go after. And Susan's story is really a heartbreaking one. It was one of the harder cases that I had to work, in part because the laws were not in a place to really be able to be responsive the way that we needed to in that particular case. But the reality is that this is happening all over the country. And one of the things I think that was really interesting in that case is we went out and we interviewed people within the communities in which her daughter was trafficked. And a lot of people within that community would say, oh, we know this is happening. We asked them, well, why did you never report it? And they said, well, it's not our problem, which is really disheartening to know that communities, we've lost sort of that community responsibility.
Right.
But the other thing, to your point, is they knew the gangs were involved, and so they feared retaliation. They said, we don't want the gangs coming after us, so we're just going to be hands off with that. And so I think that level of fear that gangs can instill, they operate exactly like terrorist organizations. They instill fear within the communities in which they control, and then they use that fear to be able to further their criminal enterprises. And so I think when we start thinking about solutions, whether it's prevention, whether it's intervention, that we need to really be thinking about how we support communities and being more responsive as well.
Right, because this is obviously something that's tied to large criminal enterprise. But as Brittany mentioned earlier, there are 25 different business models of trafficking. And so it's not just equipping communities to identify the MS-13s that are in their community, but the other different business models of trafficking. Can you touch on what some of those other models are to help people understand what this can look like?
Absolutely, right? So gangs obviously are very prolific within this, as we've talked about. There's what you might call the traditional sort of pimp model, right, which a lot of people understand, where you have one or two people that are operating. But the reality is there's so many other different forms. Familial trafficking is on the rise. Some statistics suggest that 40% of all youth that are trafficked, it was first with a family member. Those are even more difficult to identify because you kind of rely on the parent to be able to provide that intervention or that identification. But when they're the offender, when they're the perpetrator, it becomes much more challenging, and we have to be more reliant on our schools and other people within the community. We also have a differentiation between sex and labor, right? So we have labor trafficking that is often happening right in front of our faces. It might be in a popular restaurant that we all go to. I remember a case that I worked many years ago. We had gotten a report of a local spa and that there was labor trafficking happening in the spa. And I had a very good analyst that I worked with, and I remember she turned to me and she goes, I just bought a Groupon for this place. Can I still go? And I was like, absolutely not. No. And she goes, what if I go undercover? I said, no. We're not doing that. But, you know, this is the reality is these are businesses that are not hiding. This is not something that's happening in dark alleys, behind corners. It's right in front of our faces in commercial fronts. We worked another case where the front was actually a pizza shop. And you could go in and you can order pizza in this local neighborhood pizzeria. But in the back rooms, there were rooms where girls were kept. And if you knew the right words to say, you could go and purchase sex from these locations.
Different from Pizzagate, though.
Different. This was a real case. This was a case that we actually worked in Northern Virginia that I have knowledge of. So, but this is the reality of what we see. The traffickers are very sophisticated. Sometimes that's technology sophistication. Sometimes it's just street savvy.
Right.
And being able to know how to operate within those communities and where to target victims as well as buyers. And that's one thing that's incredibly important for us to remember. We talk a lot about the traffickers and the perpetrators. We talk a lot about those that have experienced exploitation. But because it is a business model, like we talked about, there would not be trafficking if there were not people that were willing to pay for these services.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Well, I mean, I think you draw out a really great point when it's happening in all of these different types of business models, from familial trafficking to pimp control trafficking to, illicit massage businesses. It is intersecting all of these different areas of community, which is why it's important to have communities equipped to understand what does it look like, what can I do.
Yeah.
But before we call communities to action, which we'll talk about what that looks like, where do you see some of the biggest deficiencies in the current response to trafficking in the U.S.? Where are we missing the mark, and where are there kind of some opportunities?
Well, I think the first place that my head goes is back to what I was mentioning earlier, right? Where there was a community that knew it was happening, but failed to report. I think there's still this hesitancy to report directly to law enforcement. I think there's a hesitancy to provide, a lot of people don't want to give their name for fear that they might get called into court, or might be dragged into the investigation, or there's some sort of retaliation from the traffickers themselves. Right. So I think really our response system in the United States, right, how we are allowing individuals to provide information. One of the things that was incredibly effective during my investigative days was really actually just parking my vehicle at the local convenience store and getting out and walking the neighborhood and talking to people. I remember one night I was at a community event at the local library, and we had given a presentation on gangs and some other things. And this little old lady came up to me afterwards, and she goes, "I need to share some information with you." And I said, "Okay, great. What do you need to tell me?" And she goes, "Oh, no, I'm not talking to you here." And I said, "Okay." And she goes, "Meet me around back at 10:30. And this is 10:30 at night. And I'm like, oh my goodness. Granny's setting me up to get jumped by some gang members. But, I said, all right. So I went around and met her that evening behind the library. And she's like, "Let me tell you where they're doing extortion, where they're selling drugs in the community." I mean, she had all kinds of information. Wow. It's really creating those communication mechanisms within community, right, to be able to allow for that responsiveness and to allow the investigators to do their job and to keep the community safe.
Right. But there's a lot of people that, there's a lot of misnomers and myths out there. So how difficult do those make law enforcement's jobs? We encourage people that if they suspect trafficking to report, but if they're operating off of false information and misnomers and myths, what does that translate to for law enforcement?
Well, I think one thing that's important in this conversation is to remember that some of those misnomers and myths translate to the officers themselves, right? Because going back to talking about the lack of training that they may have. So I think it's important, one, that they know, but then they're trained on how to identify and respond to that, right? So I think there's technology is a great tool that we can be using to help sort of filter some of that out, right, to be able to really figure out what is it that we're dealing with. And I think educating the community is really important as well, right? Tools that we can be out in community more, educating them on what are those real warning signs and red flags that need to be reported to law enforcement. Yeah. Unfortunately, Hollywood is, as you all know, has
super helpful,
right? Has really kind of painted this wrong picture. Right. I'm kind of dating myself, but back when I got started in this, we referenced the Taken movie, and how this is not what it looks like. I think we're now on like Taken 5 or something in the series, but the reality is that the more that we can educate those that are out there, I used to tell folks in community that, look, you're my eyes and my ears. I'm one investigator. I'm one detective. I can only be so many places at one time. But if you're passing that information on to me, I can be so much more effective in making sure that you're safe and that your kids are safe and neighbors are safe and all these other things.
Right. So one of the things that I've kind of noticed is people report, they kind of expect an instantaneous response. And I would love for you to kind of talk to us about, as a detective, what does it really mean to build a human trafficking case? Because you're not going to get an instant response.
Instant response, and you kick down a door, right?
Yeah, right.
that's how it goes. I mean, Kristi and I
I make a
wanna be, but
report, and the
we're gonna be
SWAT
the-
team just repels from helicopters,
Yes.
and
With
it's
Kristi,
amazing.
we would wear
Yeah.
badges.
We would.
Right.
Could you
Yeah.
deputize us? I think it'd be
Good.
great.
We've got lots of bad
Yeah.
guys we'd like to go after.
We would be really good.
I am sure you all would be excellent at that job.
See?
So
I don't think he believes us.
great investigators. I think oftentimes people forget that there is a criminal justice process that sits behind it, right? And that is to protect people, right? There is due process in our country, and there is, a court system for a reason. But in order to take something to court, you have to have a really strong case. And so that takes investigation. It takes a lot of work to corroborate a victim's account of what happened. You all have worked with many survivors, so I know that they've experienced a great deal of trauma. Mm-hmm. Asking them to go into a courtroom and share their story is really hard.
Yeah.
As a detective, I hated doing it every single time, and that was my job. Right. And so to ask somebody to go sit in front of a room of 12 of their peers on a jury, a judge, and an open courtroom, and recount some of the most horrific things that happened to them while the offender is sitting there staring them down is not an easy thing to do.
No.
And so you've really got to take your time and build cases in a very solid way. Part of it is to ensure the offender is held accountable. The other part is to really protect the victim themselves, right, when they go to testify. I remember probably the hardest case I ever took to prosecution. Was a young girl. She was 14 years old, and she had been trafficked for about a year before we encountered the situation. We were able to investigate the case, make the arrest. And so I remember the day of trial. She had to take the stand and recount what had happened to her. And so the judge had called her to the stand. She had been outside the courtroom awaiting to be called, and it took her probably 10 minutes to get the strength to be able to come into that courtroom. And so I remember tiny little girl, she came into the courtroom, head down at the ground the whole time, got up into the witness box, put her head in her lap, and was able to answer the questions. She did a fantastic job. I mean, the prosecutor was asking questions. She was able to recall details. Really, really great job testifying. But then it got to that last question the prosecutor had to ask. And he said, the person you've been talking about today, do you see them sitting here in the courtroom? See, every victim has to identify, every witness has to identify the defendant. Took her no less than 5 minutes to garner the strength to raise her head, to point to him and say, that's him, and then went unconscious and fell out of the witness box.
Wow.
Now, this shows the trauma or the re-victimization that happens through that criminal justice process. And it also puts us in a really bad situation because now we have this young girl who had just went unconscious. Of course, we called medics to come in and tend to her, but we had a decision to make. If she went to the hospital, a mistrial would be declared, and then we would have to start the process all over again. But do we ask this 14-year-old to get back up on the stand to be cross-examined by defense counsel? Now, ultimately, in this case, we left it up to her, and she just an unbelievable young lady, brave young lady who said, I want to testify, got back on the stand. Of course, defense counsel didn't have much to say at that point, asked a few questions, and got her off the stand. But I mean, her bravery and her courage to be able to do that is just unbelievable. And I was, just as a side note, I was so blessed. About 9 months after that, I got a call and she said, I'm being baptized today. Will you come?
Aww.
And so that was really, there were some really positive moments throughout my investigative days where I got to be a part of or just witness things outside of the investigative process that were really, really encouraging and hopeful.
Yeah. So you hear those stories, and it makes me think of Susan's earlier, where the legislative framework wasn't in place. The laws weren't in place to properly go after the traffickers and buyers. We can submit tips as community members to law enforcement. Law enforcement, you hope, is equipped to understand how to do effective investigations and look into this issue and is resourced and all of that. But if all of those things happen, and then the legislative framework isn't in place to properly prosecute traffickers and buyers and protect victims, then we're sunk. Mm-hmm. Where are we at as a nation to actually to have that proper legislation in place on the state level, on the federal level, because for the number of human trafficking cases we have and the number of prosecutions that have actually gotten through, our balance isn't quite there.
Right.
Yeah. We've come a long way, but there is a lot more room to grow in this space. And I think a lot of it, too, is just our understanding of the space. You know, when I started working cases as an investigator, we really didn't know how to prosecute cases, how to build cases. We've grown in our knowledge quite a bit. But the law needs to catch up with that and be able to give those investigators, give prosecutors and courts the tools that they need to be able to effectively go after these cases. So I think that, there needs to be alignment. We're very unique here in the United States with our federal system, which is separate from individual states. And so I think there's a lot of room for additional alignment across all the states, as well as enhancing penalties on the federal level, enhancing penalties for buyers, making the threshold for prosecution a lot lower. So as an example, not to get too technical, but on the federal side, there's when you're prosecuting a case involving a minor, there's what's called opportunity to observe, meaning that the prosecution doesn't have to prove the offender knew that they were under the age of 18, just that they had the opportunity to observe, right? And so that allows for those enhancements in penalties. That doesn't exist at the state level in a lot of places. And so little things like that where we can mirror some of those advancements would really go a long way in making investigators' jobs easier, prosecutors' jobs easier, and really bringing justice to victims.
So kind of going to that, you wrote a book called Eradicating Human Trafficking.
We wrote a book.
Yeah, I was about to say, no, don't take yourself out of this. You guys
Your name comes
co-wrote
first.
a phenomenal book.
Okay. So we wrote a book once upon a time about collective impact. Speak to us a little bit about what collective impact means to you.
I'm a big believer. Ever since the very beginning of doing this work, in fact, the very first sort of collaborative approach that I had, I was a detective, and I got a call from a counselor one day, and she said, "Hey, I think that we have a similar case. There's somebody that I'm working with that I think you're investigating the case." I said, "Oh, great! Like, who is it? I can't tell you that." And I said, "Okay, well, is there information that you want to share?" And she goes, "Yeah." And I said, "Okay, what is it?" And she goes, "I can't share that with you." I said, "Okay." She goes, "Well, I'm not going to have the conversation over the phone." And I said, "All right, well, I'll come to your office and we'll chat." And she goes, "Oh, no, you're not coming to my office." I said, "Okay, you can come to my office." She goes, "Oh, no, I'm not coming to your office."
She was making your job super easy.
Yeah,
at this
so I was
point.
like, "Well, what do we do?"
Applebee's?
And she goes,
Applebee's.
Fancy like
she
Applebee's.
goes, "I'll meet you at Applebee's tonight."
There it is.
And we'll have a conversation. And so here I'm like really confused. There's a lot of times I thought I was going to get jumped throughout my career. And so I show up at the Applebee's.
In a dark alley.
And what I learned through that conversation is that just because I was a law enforcement officer does not mean that people within the community inherently trusted me. And I needed to earn her trust that she could share information and vice versa. And so it was a really eye-opening experience for me. And I would say that one encounter really opened the door for me to understanding this concept of collective impact. We all come together and work collaboratively. We all share resources and information and approaches. One of the challenges that I had early on as a detective was we didn't have a lot of support like Safe House Project to be able to step in and provide restorative care, connections and referrals and other services to these survivors. And so we were triaging a lot. And that was a real distraction. I wasn't trained. I'm not a social worker. And so we learned that once we were able to pool resources, bring people to the table, it made my job a lot easier. It made their jobs a lot easier. And ultimately, it allowed us to serve those survivors with a lot more excellence, right? With dignity and respect that they deserved, instead of just trying to piecemeal our way through those different situations. It's a very complex, human trafficking is very complex. And oftentimes people get very siloed. And they say, well, this is my lane. I'm going to stay in my lane. Collective impact is saying, okay, here's my lane, but how does this help you
Right.
do your job as well? And how can we collaborate and coordinate with each other? It sounds really simple, right? But in practice, it becomes very difficult. And so I was really honored to write the book with Brittany on that, to really kind of provide that roadmap for, okay, let's understand the problem and let's understand where these different pieces can start to come together and how do we do that effectively and how do we coordinate?
Right. So they won't plug their book, but I will. If you would like to read their phenomenal book on what it's going to take to see trafficking eradicated in America by 2030, please go. I'm sure we can drop the link somewhere in the podcast. But it's a phenomenal book that is going to equip you to understand the issue and understand what we as Americans can do to ensure that we are seeing freedom for all trafficking victims. So you two wouldn't plug yourselves. I'm convinced of it. But I appreciate your point, and I feel like the times that we've gone into certain communities and really seen things working well are the times that somehow they've gotten it figured out. Right. You know, they've worked together. You've got service providers, you've got law enforcement, you've got healthcare workers, you've got all of these different groups and community members sharing information and passing it. And they're able to prevent some of these trafficking cases because you've got the Child Advocacy Center that's going, hey, we've got this kid that's coming in. We're really seeing, risk indicators. And they try to stop it before it ever happens. But if it does happen that child is exploited, then that information has already been shared across all of these different agencies, and they're able to intervene and get services started earlier and break the cycles of victimization earlier. But you don't see this happening in all communities. Why?
Well, had a conversation with a chief of police from North Carolina yesterday, and he was telling me he had gotten information about a human trafficking case in another jurisdiction, several counties over, and he had called that chief and said, hey, this is what I've got. I've got information about human trafficking. And the other chief said, we don't have human trafficking in our jurisdiction. I think, unfortunately, but it is the sad reality, is that too many of our leaders within community don't want to admit that there's a human trafficking problem. It looks bad, or we may dissuade people from moving into our community, or we may have to dedicate resources that we don't feel that we have. And so I think there's a general denial that human trafficking is impacting every single community across America. If the services are not being sold in that community, it is very possible that young people are being targeted in that community because the internet just tears down any border, barrier, jurisdictional boundary. It doesn't matter anymore. Right. So I think there is the awareness piece that's critical, but I think along with that's an acceptance piece. We have to accept that it is a problem, it is here, and we need to respond to it. Yeah.
That makes me think, I know Brittany, my co-founder, loves data. It's her favorite thing. But it makes me think about how data, if represented incorrectly, can paint a false picture that reinforces narratives. And so it makes me think there's a heat map that has circulated for years. It's probably the same one that's been around for
2 decades.
Long time. But it's a heat map that is representative of the reports of human trafficking that have been sent to the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And so it's showing where there are hotspots of reports of human trafficking. But these are in major metropolitan areas where they're highly populous, and people believe that is solely indicative of the places where there is trafficking. One, those are the cities where trafficking training might be more easily widespread, more easily to access. Or two, again, it's a populous area. But when you look at a picture of the United States and you see rural Montana that has absolutely nothing on it, then it can reinforce the narrative that human trafficking doesn't happen here. Why is data, I'm going to turn this to you.
Yes.
Why is data, because they also wrote a second book on data, by the way. So why is data and proper representation of data so critical to go against false narratives?
Yeah. Well, first of all, ethical data collection is critical in this space, and we have to make sure that we are following all the proper protocols, especially considering the vulnerable population that we serve. But when collected ethically, data really can be used as a tool to empower communities to understand where trafficking is actually happening, what types of trafficking are happening, and also what are the maybe local trends, those cultural nuances that we have to consider. And so I think that sometimes we look at data at this 30,000-foot view and we draw out a lot of generalizations versus diving deep and saying, okay, if we're talking about rural Montana, what are the local considerations that we need to evaluate? And what are the trafficking cases per 100,000?
Right.
That original heat map did not normalize that data against population density.
Right.
So when you're not actually using effective data techniques and tools to make sure that you're analyzing it, then of course you can make data say any story that you want. But I think the other piece that we've really worked hard to do is also bring those lived experience experts to the table as we analyze the data, because that makes sure that we're not just considering our lens on the issue, but we're making sure that it's informed by their lived experience, because they might have that qualitative experience, that anecdotal evidence that we need that's going to be critical to understanding that data point. And so at the end of the day, data is a guide, but it's really the human-centric response that should lead the way.
Yeah, I mean, I think a great example of that was, I mean, people can follow the narrative that in these rural areas that there's no trafficking. And we had a trafficking survivor that we were able to help exit, but she had actually been trafficked on, was it dove hunting farms?
Yes.
In like the middle of, I think it was
Montana.
like Montana or North Dakota. And nobody was reporting that.
Right.
But it doesn't mean it wasn't happening. It just was on these large ranches where men were coming in to do dove hunting, and they had a supply of women that they were bringing in for these men. And so it's exactly, the survivor narrative helps paint the picture in ways that we might be missing it if we don't include them in the conversation.
Right. Which I think is why it's been so critical that we have recently launched Simply Report.
Right.
I mean, Simply Report really is hopefully going to lead the way in aggregating those tips in a secure, anonymous way, following informed consent. But I think it should help to bridge some of the gaps you were talking about, where you had these cases and you're going in and talking to community members and they said, I just don't feel comfortable reporting. Well, if we can put a simple, secure way between them and that feeling of insecurity against like organized crime and MS-13, all of a sudden, hopefully we can see a lot more data coming in and be able to really map this more effectively.
Yeah, I think, I'm very excited about Simply Report as it continues to garner national attention, and more tips are coming into the system. I think it really is the answer to a lot of those problems. One, it's a tool that law enforcement or anyone can use to help better identify whether or not a situation's trafficking. It creates that anonymity that, it oftentimes is a prevention or a speed bump along the way, right, to getting those reports to law enforcement. And it collects the data, right? I mean, Brittany, you're much smarter than I am on the data front. However, I can appreciate, like the usage of it, right? And how much it can drive. Even in policing, we talk about data-driven policing, right? We've talked a lot about data-driven policy, in the larger scheme of things. And so I think the more data that we can apply, both raw data and data that's clean and not skewed to a particular narrative, will allow us to implement the legislation that we talked about earlier. It'll allow us to enhance the training capabilities that we have for law enforcement and other frontline professionals, to equip parents, to equip community members, et cetera, to be able to be a part of the fight instead of just having to stand back on the sidelines and feeling hopeless.
Yeah. And so I think a great example of that I'd love for you to share is what happened when you all took you took the data-driven approach to law enforcement and you did some really targeted interventions into one of the communities around gang activity. Can you share a bit more about how that kind of played out?
Yeah, so when I was working gangs, we were I was kind of assigned the area where MS-13 was the most concentrated. And they were pretty violent. They had control over the community. They were controlling local businesses. Kids would walk to and from school in fear. A lot of, like I mentioned, violence and stuff in that community. Through targeting that, doing direct outreach within the community, and looking at, when are the high levels of gang activity? Where are they at? It helped us to really understand the problem with almost a surgical precision. And we were able to focus resources. And over the course of about 9 months, we reduced gang crime by over 80%
Wow.
within that community. So it works.
Yeah.
Leveraging data and then using that to get out into community is really powerful.
No, I so appreciate that. And I think that's just our call to action is that at the end of the day, if we simply report tips to law enforcement, then we are equipping our community with the tool to really identify and report suspected trafficking, as well as giving our law enforcement agents that actionable intelligence. And so we really encourage you to download Simply Report and be part of the solution, because all of us are responsible for creating a healthier community, for creating a safer community, creating a place where our kids can grow up free of exploitation. So, Bill, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for your years of service, for walking along survivors in such a trauma-informed way, for just really leading this nation in so many ways. We cannot thank you for your expertise and willingness to be here. So thank you for joining us for the Teen Protectors podcast. We look forward to seeing you on the next episode.